They called him a healer, a savior in a white coat, the kind of doctor every patient dreams of having. His name was spoken with reverence in quiet hospital corridors and busy family dinners where relatives reassured each other, "You're in the best hands." He was the doctor who brought peace to the terminally ill, comforted grieving families, and made the unbearable feel just a little lighter. But behind his kind smile and gentle bedside manner, this trusted figure harbored a sinister secret. While others believed he was saving lives, he was quietly ending them, hundreds of them, over decades. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about one man's shocking betrayal. It's about the fragility of trust. It's about the danger of assuming that authority always comes with integrity. And, most chilling of all, it's about how easily evil can wear a mask of kindness. In a small, unassuming town, patients flocked to him, not knowing they were stepping into the hands of a killer. This man didn't wield a knife in a dark alley or break into homes under the cover of night. His weapon was far more insidious, his knowledge of medicine and the blind faith of those who sought his care. You see, trust isn't earned in the moment. It's built over time through countless little gestures. A warm smile here, a reassuring word there. He had perfected this craft. But trust, when misplaced, becomes a weapon, and in his hands, it was deadly. Families said goodbye to loved ones, thinking nature had simply taken its course. Little did they know, the course had been unnaturally and deliberately cut short. For years, whispers of suspicion went unnoticed, brushed aside as the ramblings of grief-stricken relatives. Who would dare question a man with such a sterling reputation? But as the body count grew, so did the doubts. And soon, one investigator would stumble upon a thread, a single, frayed piece of truth that once pulled, unraveled a tapestry of deceit, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. This is the story of how one man exploited the very trust meant to heal, leaving behind a trail of broken families and unanswered questions. This is the story of the doctor who betrayed us all. Before he became the monster lurking in plain sight, he was a man who seemed destined for greatness. Born in a quiet middle-class neighborhood, Dr. Edward Shaw, the name that would later haunt so many, was the golden child of his family. From a young age, he exhibited a natural curiosity about the human body, an unquenchable desire to understand how things worked. His parents, a humble schoolteacher and a factory worker, beamed with pride as Edward excelled in school, his name always at the top of every academic achievement list. By the time he entered medical school, he was already a local hero. The boy next door turned brilliant young doctor. He had an uncanny ability to connect with people, to put them at ease. His classmates admired him. Professors sang his praises. A natural healer, they'd say. But even back then, there were glimpses of something darker beneath the surface, tiny cracks in his otherwise perfect facade. Edward wasn't just ambitious, he was obsessed with control. He despised failure, even in the smallest of tasks. If a lab experiment didn't go as planned, he'd obsess over it for days, blaming others or circumstances instead of himself. It was as if he believed he was destined to be infallible. To Edward, the world was a chessboard, and he was always 3 moves ahead. After medical school, Edward returned to his hometown, now armed with a prestigious degree and an unshakable air of authority. Patients adored him instantly. His calm demeanor, warm smile, and ability to remember even the smallest details about their lives made him seem more like a friend than a doctor. He didn't just prescribe medicine. He offered hope, comfort, and understanding. His waiting room was always full, with people willing to endure hours just for a few minutes of his time. But his charm wasn't just natural, it was calculated. Edward knew the value of trust, and he worked tirelessly to cultivate it. Every kind word, every act of generosity was a carefully chosen move in a much larger game. He donated to local charities, attended community events, and even made house calls for patients too sick to visit his office. To everyone around him, he was a saint. Behind closed doors, though, a different man emerged. Edward's meticulousness wasn't just about being a good doctor, it was about control. He kept detailed records, but not for the reasons one might think. He monitored his patients with the precision of a scientist studying lab rats, cataloging their vulnerabilities, their fears, and their trust. He knew who had no family to ask questions, who was too frail to resist, and who would be too grief-stricken to doubt him. His first victim wasn't even supposed to be a victim at all. She was an elderly woman, a longtime patient with a chronic illness that had worn her down. Edward had prescribed her medication for years, and when her condition took a sudden turn for the worse, no one batted an eye. "Natural causes," he wrote on her death certificate, and the family thanked him for his kindness. That first death gave Edward a taste of something he hadn't expected. Power. The kind of power that came from playing God, from deciding who lived and who died. It wasn't long before he began testing the limits of his newfound control. A slightly higher dose of painkillers here, a delayed diagnosis there. Each decision was a subtle act of defiance against the natural order, and each time he got away with it. Over the years, Edward perfected his methods. He learned how to manipulate medical records to hide his tracks, how to charm skeptical family members into trusting him implicitly, and how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the sick and the elderly. He became so skilled at deception that even his closest colleagues never suspected a thing. But Edward's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He was too good at what he did, too confident in his ability to manipulate the truth. And in his arrogance, he began to grow careless. He started pushing boundaries, experimenting with new methods, and leaving behind tiny, almost imperceptible clues. The town's beloved doctor was no longer just a healer. He was a predator, hiding in plain sight, his mask of kindness so convincing that no one thought to question him. Not yet. But cracks were beginning to form in Edward's perfect world, and it was only a matter of time before someone looked a little closer. For years, Dr. Edward Shaw's world seemed untouchable. The community worshipped him as a pillar of compassion, and his colleagues often envied the loyalty and admiration he commanded from his patients. Deaths happened under his care, of course, but they were inevitable in a doctor's line of work, particularly for someone who specialized in treating the elderly and the terminally ill. No one thought twice about it. Not at first. But whispers have a way of growing into murmurs, and murmurs eventually turn into questions. It all started with Margaret Rowe, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s who had brought her aging father to Dr. Shaw for years. Her father, Thomas Rowe, was in failing health, but Margaret always believed he had more time. That was until one winter morning when she got the call. Her father had passed in his sleep, Doctor. Shaw explained softly, his voice filled with regret. It was peaceful, he assured her, and there was nothing more we could have done. Grief-stricken, Margaret thanked him for his kindness, but as the weeks passed, something began gnawing at her, a small but unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. Her father had seemed no worse than usual during his last visit. In fact, he'd been laughing at one of her jokes just the day before. And yet, Dr. Shaw had mentioned a sudden change, a quiet decline that no one else had noticed. Margaret wasn't the only one harboring doubts. Across town, Linda Carter, whose mother had been under Dr. Shaw's care, was struggling with similar unease. Her mother's health had been stable until she was prescribed a new medication. Within days, she had grown lethargic and disoriented. When Linda questioned Dr. Shaw about the sudden change, he dismissed her concerns as side effects of her mother's condition. A week later, her mother was gone. The cases were isolated, or so they seemed. Families, each grieving their losses, trusted Dr. Shaw's explanations. After all, who would question such a respected man? But the doubts didn't disappear. They simmered beneath the surface, whispered at community gatherings and over cups of coffee. The turning point came when a nurse at the hospital, a diligent young woman named Clara Hughes, noticed an unsettling pattern. Clara had always admired Dr. Shaw, but she couldn't ignore the fact that an unusual number of his patients seemed to deteriorate unexpectedly. And it wasn't just the frequency, it was the timing. Many of these patients had been receiving new prescriptions or changes in their medication shortly before their deaths. Clara began keeping her own notes, quietly documenting the patients who passed under Dr. Shaw's care. The more she dug, the more troubling the patterns became. She shared her concerns with a colleague, but her fears were dismissed as overthinking. "Patients die, Clara. It's part of the job," they told her. But Clara couldn't let it go. She reached out to Margaret Rowe and Linda Carter, cautiously testing the waters. Their stories confirmed her suspicions. There was something wrong, something no one else seemed willing to see. Fueled by a growing sense of duty, Clara decided to report her concerns to the hospital administration. The response was lukewarm at best. Dr. Shaw was a beloved figure, after all, and casting doubt on him was akin to heresy. The administrators promised to look into it, but Clara's gut told her they wouldn't. Still, Clara's actions set something in motion. Margaret, Linda, and a handful of other families began comparing notes, finding eerie similarities in their loved ones' deaths. Their voices grew louder, and soon they caught the attention of a local investigator, Detective Alan Price. Price wasn't the type to ignore a lead, no matter how thin it seemed. As he reviewed the deaths, he noticed a troubling consistency in the timelines and circumstances. The same medications, the same symptoms, the same quiet explanations. And behind every case was the same reassuring smile, the smile of Dr. Edward Shaw. What had begun as isolated whispers was now a chorus of suspicion. The question wasn't if something was wrong. It was how far the truth would go. Detective Alan Price was no stranger to unraveling mysteries, but this case felt different from the start. He wasn't investigating a robbery or a violent assault. There was no smoking gun, no clear evidence of a crime. What he had instead were patterns, whispers, and a gnawing sense that something deeply sinister was lurking beneath the surface. Price began with the families who had raised concerns. Margaret Rowe and Linda Carter were among the first to sit across from him in his cramped office, each clutching folders of their own hastily gathered notes. They spoke with a mix of grief and determination, recounting the eerily similar circumstances surrounding their loved ones' deaths. At first, Price wasn't sure what to make of it. Medical cases were complex, and doctors often had to make difficult decisions. But the more he listened, the more unsettled he became. "Have you noticed anything unusual about his prescriptions?" Price asked Margaret. She nodded. "He changed my father's medication the week before he passed. Said it was to make him more comfortable, but he'd never mentioned it before." Linda added, "Same with my mother. She'd been stable for months, and then suddenly there's a new drug, and within days she was gone." Price jotted down notes and leaned back in his chair. Patterns. There were always patterns, but this one was starting to feel deliberate. Armed with the family's accounts, Price obtained access to the hospital records, a process that was far from easy. Dr. Edward Shaw's reputation was a powerful shield. Even as whispers of suspicion grew louder, many in the hospital administration bristled at the idea of investigating one of their most esteemed doctors. But Price was persistent, and after weeks of wrangling, he finally secured a limited review of patient files. The records told a chilling story. In case after case, Dr. Shaw's patients had died shortly after receiving new prescriptions or altered dosages. Price noted the striking consistency. sudden deteriorations, unexplained symptoms, and vague death certificates that listed causes like natural causes or complications of chronic illness. Most damning of all, many of these patients had been relatively stable before their sudden declines. One file stood out in particular, that of a woman named Eleanor Briggs, a widow in her 70s who had no close family. Her records showed a drastic increase in her morphine dosage just days before her death. Price couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. He needed more than just gut instincts and paperwork. He needed proof. Price reached out to Clara Hughes, the nurse whose observations had first set the investigation in motion. Clara, nervous but resolute, agreed to help. She provided detailed notes she had kept, highlighting specific patients whose deaths had raised red flags. He always insisted on handling the medication changes himself, Clara said. Even when it wasn't protocol. I thought it was strange, but you don't question someone like Dr. Shaw. Was untouchable. Price began interviewing more staff members. Many were hesitant to speak, afraid of jeopardizing their careers. But slowly, a picture began to emerge. A picture of a man who had built his career not on trust, but on manipulation and fear. Nurses described how Dr. Shaw would brush off questions about his decisions, using his charm to disarm them. Others mentioned feeling uneasy about how often he was present during the final moments of his patients' lives. "I always thought he cared too much," one nurse admitted. "But now I wonder, maybe he cared too much about something else entirely." Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Price needed hard evidence, something that would stand up in court. He consulted a forensic toxicologist to review the medication histories of several patients. The toxicologist's findings were damning. In multiple cases, the levels of morphine and other sedatives in the deceased patient's systems far exceeded what would have been necessary for palliative care. These weren't just oversights, they were deliberate overdoses. The investigation intensified. Price obtained a warrant to search Dr. Shaw's office and home. The search turned up meticulous records. Too meticulous. Shaw had documented every interaction with his patients, every change in medication, every decision he'd made. On the surface, it appeared thorough, but to Price, it was a red flag. The level of detail felt more like someone trying to cover their tracks than an ordinary doctor's notes. In one chilling notebook, Price found what he later described as Shaw's playbook. It contained cryptic annotations about patients, including phrases like "no family," "weak heart," and "likely no questions." These notes painted a horrifying picture of how Shaw had chosen his victims, targeting those least likely to draw suspicion. But perhaps the most incriminating discovery came in the form of falsified death certificates. Shaw had listed natural causes in every case, but discrepancies in medical records told a different story. In some cases, the symptoms leading up to death were inconsistent with the prescribed medications, raising the question of whether Shaw had administered something else entirely. When Price finally confronted Shaw, the doctor's demeanor was as calm and controlled as ever. He didn't deny the deaths, nor did he admit to any wrongdoing. Instead, he spoke in carefully measured tones, deflecting blame and painting himself as a compassionate caregiver. "These patients were suffering," Shaw said. "I did what I thought was best for them." Sometimes medicine isn't about prolonging life, it's about easing pain, but Price wasn't buying it. There was a difference between easing pain and playing God, and the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to the latter. Armed with his findings, Price arrested Dr. Shaw, charging him with multiple counts of murder. The case sent shockwaves through the community. Families who had once praised Shaw now grappled with the devastating truth. Investigators continued to piece together the full extent of his crimes, uncovering a staggering number of victims, far more than they had initially suspected. For Detective Price, the work was far from over. The investigation had opened a Pandora's box, exposing not just the dark deeds of one man, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. But one thing was clear: Dr. Edward Shaw's reign of terror was finally over. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Rows of spectators, reporters, and family members of the victims sat in silence as the once revered doctor. Edward Shaw entered in handcuffs, his expression calm, almost detached. The man who had once been the town's trusted healer now stood accused of murder, his mask of benevolence shattered by the damning evidence laid bare by Detective Alan Price and his team. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a chilling picture of Shaw's actions. They began by detailing the victims, naming each one with precision. Photos of smiling faces, now reduced to memories, flashed on a screen. The prosecution described how Shaw had exploited his position to administer lethal overdoses, targeting the vulnerable and the voiceless, those least likely to draw suspicion. Forensic toxicologists testified about the unnaturally high levels of morphine and other drugs found in the victims' systems, each dose meticulously tied back to Shaw's prescriptions. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the notebook Detective Price had discovered. The prosecution presented it to the jury, highlighting the coded annotations that marked each victim's vulnerability. Phrases like "no family" and "fragile health" revealed a deliberate, calculated method of selecting targets. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor held up the notebook, calling it a blueprint for murder. Throughout the trial, Shaw's defense clung to a single narrative. He had acted out of compassion. His lawyer argued that Shaw's actions were not murder, but mercy, a desperate attempt to ease suffering in patients who had little hope. They framed him as a misunderstood figure, a man whose intentions had been noble, but whose methods had crossed an ethical line. Shaw himself took the stand, his demeanor as calm and composed as ever. "I've dedicated my life to helping people," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes medicine isn't about prolonging life, it's about ending pain." He denied the allegations of malice, insisting that his decisions were always made in the best interests of his patients. But the prosecution dismantled this defense piece by piece. They called witnesses, nurses like Clara Hughes, who testified about Shaw's unusual control over medication protocols. Families recounted how their loved ones had been stable before sudden, unexplained declines under Shaw's care. And forensic experts confirmed that many of the overdoses were far beyond what would be considered palliative. The turning point came when the jury heard from survivors, patients who had narrowly escaped Shaw's lethal doses. One man, admitted for routine treatment, described feeling drugged after an unnecessary injection. He had recovered, but only because a nurse intervened. His testimony sent chills through the courtroom, painting Shaw not as a healer, but as a predator. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Dr. Edward Shaw was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the families, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but the scars remained. The trial exposed not only Shaw's horrific actions, but also the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Hospital administrators faced scrutiny for ignoring early warnings, and protocols for monitoring medical professionals were overhauled nationwide. As the gavel fell and Shaw was led away, the town was left to grapple with an unsettling truth. The man they had trusted most had betrayed them in the worst possible way, and though justice had been served, the shadow of his crimes would linger for years to come. The conviction of Dr. Edward Shaw sent ripples far beyond the small town where his crimes had unfolded. National headlines dubbed him the Angel of Death, a chilling moniker for a man who had once been the embodiment of trust and compassion. For the families of his victims, the verdict offered a bittersweet sense of justice, an acknowledgement of their pain, though it could never undo the damage. In the wake of the trial, the medical community faced a harsh reckoning. Hospitals across the country reevaluated their protocols for oversight, introducing stricter guidelines for prescribing and monitoring controlled substances. The case served as a glaring reminder that even those in positions of utmost trust could misuse their authority, often unchecked for far too long. Clara Hughes, the nurse who had been instrumental in exposing Shaw, became an advocate for systemic change. Her testimony and relentless pursuit of the truth inspired new policies aimed at empowering medical staff to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. "This isn't just about one man," she said in an interview. "It's about creating a system where people can't hide behind their titles." But for the families of the victims, the systemic changes were little solace. They were left with empty chairs at dinner tables, memories of loved ones stolen too soon, and the haunting knowledge that the person they had trusted most was responsible. The story of Edward Shaw is more than just a true crime tale. It's a cautionary lesson about the dangers of blind trust and the fragility of systems meant to protect us. It reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with malice. Sometimes it smiles at us in a white coat, offering comfort while quietly betraying us. And in the end, the question remains, how many others like him have yet to be unmasked? The story of Dr. Edward Shaw is one that lingers, not because of the number of lives he took, but because of the trust he shattered. He wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in the dark. He was a beacon of hope, a man whose very presence reassured families during their most vulnerable moments. And that's what makes his betrayal so chilling. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The systems we rely on to protect us are not infallible. Even those entrusted with the greatest responsibility, saving lives, are capable of unspeakable harm. It's a reminder to remain vigilant, to question authority when something feels wrong, and to advocate for those who cannot speak for themselves. For the families of Shaw's victims, closure came in the form of justice, but the scars remain. They remind us that trust is a fragile thing, and once broken, it can leave devastation in its wake. Yet their courage in speaking out has sparked changes that may one day save lives, ensuring that Shaw's actions were not in vain. As we leave this story behind, one question echoes. How well do we truly know the people we trust with our lives? Perhaps the answer is one we'd rather not face. Thanks for watching till the end. If you love our crime stories, please subscribe and let us know what you feel in the comments. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching our videos.